like to, first of all, welcome all of you and thank you for coming, members of the media, most importantly, friends and supporters of Pauline and myself and the charity. And it's important that I tell you why we picked this club. Burt's is a very special place to me because this is where I met Pauline. I met her at that bar right there. That was the first time I met Pauline. The second time I came down here with Pauline is after she bailed me out of jail. Busted for allegedly burglarizing my own office by my ex-wife as I was going through a nasty divorce. When the cops picked me up and brought me to the station, I said, "What's your evidence?" Because this is, you can imagine the words I use. So they gave me the date and time, and I laughed my head off because it was the date and time I was actually at the police officers club with a bunch of senior inspectors managing the Hong Kong participant who was going to run in the Badwater Death Valley Ultra Marathon. And at the time, actually, there was a picture in the correspondent of me training him in the gym, and I can't figure out who took that picture, where the guy's doing push-ups, and I'm drinking vodka and blowing cigar in his face because of psychological. Those races, it's more psychological than physical. So, needless to say, I got released, but Pauline was very upset because I was supposed to meet her for dinner to say goodbye to people at the airport, mutual friends who were leaving. I didn't make dinner. So when she came to bail me out, she was not a happy camper either. So when we came down here, we commiserated. And the reason I bring that up is because Custom Made actually is the last chapter here, 8, ends in Burt's. And it talks about how down and out I was. And the new book, Backspin, picks up at Burt's, that chapter 8. And all the good things that have happened since. And my books basically address politics, US-China relations, nonfiction, and at the same time, I try and tackle issues that are very personal to all of us. And one of the most important issues that I address in the book is homelessness, because I wrote that book, Custom Made, based on what happened on 9/11 and why the world had literally stopped turning on 9/11. And then when January 6th hit, it was really very traumatic to me. As I spent a lot of time in the Capitol, means a lot, and I was actually very pissed off. So when I looked and analyzed what happened, when you look at this guy, and half these people up there, they're homeless. This guy lives with his mom. The underlying causes of protests in the US, Hong Kong, and around the world is homelessness, rent control. How do people get a house over their head? I was talking to Johan, who's with the Swedish broadcasters over there. We were talking earlier, the Swedish government collapsed last week. Why? Rent control. What do we see in the papers around Hong Kong lately? All of a sudden, housing again. It's become a hot topic. Why? Because the government has woken up to the fact that one of their underlying primary causes of the protests of 214 and 219 is the fact that people can't afford to either live, whether they rent or buy, or rent premises to run a business, retail, commercial, manufacturing, industrial, or agricultural. They all wind up having to move. Even organic farms in the new territories, I was talking to people. Farms going well, things are going well, they gotta leave. The combination of the two, of the protest and homelessness, and the fact that I was a real estate lawyer in the US representing landlords who evicted people and rent control and fought all those issues. But now in Hong Kong I'm a tenant. And when I get whacked with 120% rent increase on a business, I figure there's something wrong with this picture. And so how do you, as a writer or a political activist, and I've been a political activist forever, now tackle the housing issue, especially in Hong Kong, which is the highest rental market in the world. Second highest market, New York. Third, Singapore. Fourth, Tokyo. So I figured, why not maybe write something with a solution, a proposal, and it's something to start. A Rent Subsidy Act. And so I researched rent control, history of rent, going all the way back to biblical times. Believe it or not, there was rent control in biblical times. All the way through Roman times, all of which I've documented. And we all know there's been rent control in Hong Kong, all across Europe, and just about every major state in the US. Again, all documented in this book. Now, the reason I decided to release it chapter by chapter is because if you analyze how millennials and all the generations younger than us read, they can't spend more than a chapter at a time. Every study shows that. So I decided, you know what? How can I release a book chapter by chapter, month by month, in a way that I can market it? Because those of us who are writers in the room know, writing a book is the easiest part. Selling it, marketing it is the hardest part. So I decided, let me check out historically who has done books in bits and pieces. Charles Dickens. He would write short stories and then combine them into a book. So that's what I decided to do. So this chapter, because it proposes a solution which I will address, and there are other political issues I address. For example, Susan is a lawyer here in town who writes a column for The Standard, and I talked to her about political issues that she and I agree on, something you would agree on, Harp. The question she asks me every time she sees me, did you get your judgment yet? All right? That's a whole other subject in another book about the legal system in Hong Kong and the rule of law. But that's to be continued if those of you are interested to pursue the direction I go. So what I'm proposing in this book is a Rent Subsidy Act, a solution to people affording their housing or business. And what is the solution? Historically, it's rent control. Rent control doesn't work, it's never worked, never will work. Because the minute rent control is imposed, landlords find different ways to get around it. The solution is a very simple one. Make sure a tenant doesn't have to pay more than 25% of their income for rent, and make sure the landlord developer gets a reasonable return on their investment. The question is, what is reasonable, which is going to be different in every city, every county, every state, every country. So I'm proposing a solution to bridge the financing between what the tenant can pay and the landlord wants. What is the solution? Look at religious charities. They are religiously exempted from taxation because their charters provide that they have to provide housing for the needy, among many other things. Do they? No. If you look at all the numbers that they release and publish, most of the money actually goes to their investments, bigger churches, bigger houses for the bishops, not for the needy, does not comply with any of the statutory or legal requirements they agreed to comply with. Why have they never been challenged or questioned? Because they represent the political constituency. And nobody wants to upset a political constituency. You look at political constituencies in the US, Hong Kong, or any other country, religious groups play a major role in electing whoever the leader in that country is. So they've been left untouched. I'm proposing it's time to touch them. It's time to get them to honor their commitments, because housing is something they have committed to do. The other player that we have to look at is lenders. Lenders make money off the developers, the builders, the landlords, the mortgages, the tenants or consumers, any which way you look at it. And right now all the lenders are saying, yeah, we're into sustainability, environment, and how can we put all this money into good use? The other thing, since there are some bankers in the room, is a lot of them have charities. Do you know what, or do they know what some of the charitable money that they donate goes to? No, they don't care. They just, yeah, we've got this charity, we do this. I've been involved with some of them, and does the money really go to where they think it's going? No. So why not get lenders and religious charities, and I'm not limiting it to religious charities, it can be other charities that want to support people, housing, homeless, needy, because Hong Kong now is waking up to that reality. So what I am proposing is that Hong Kong come up with this Rent Subsidy Act, because it is the most expensive place to rent, and that Hong Kong start exporting it as an idea to other countries, starting with China, because China is now complaining about housing costs, rental costs, never mind the US. Housing is a non-political issue that Hong Kong can very easily use to bridge the conflicts between even China and the US. And I am proposing that that is what Hong Kong do. And the way it can do it is by introducing it. Even this morning, I see Carrie Lam now and CY are starting to argue again about what is the right way to do it. Hong Kong has the land, whether it's brownfields, parks, there's plenty of land to build whatever Hong Kong needs. And as Xi Jinping said back in 2017 when he was here, housing is for living, not investing. And China is starting to make that move, both in China and here. So I'm saying, you know what? Instead of me just writing and criticizing and using metaphors, which I've done in all the books, let's me propose something constructive. So that's what my proposal is. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's a starting point. And as a writer, you know, when you have editors, and I've got my editors here, Viswa and Hari sitting back there, they can make your life miserable. So when it comes to looking at legislation, let's at least start somewhere and figure out how to fine-tune it, because all we have to do is look at Singapore. Singapore is probably the most politically autocratic dictatorial system in the world. But do people complain? No. Why? They have housing, health, and education. Hong Kong has the education and the health component, but not the housing component. So let's introduce it. Let's start somewhere and stop the pressure that the real estate lobbies are proposing. So that is what I propose in this chapter that you've all been given. And also at the end of the chapter, there is a survey that I urge you to look at, take, tell your friends to. And there are 5 elements to that survey. If you're a tenant, you can take it as a tenant. If you're a landlord or developer, you can take it as a landlord-developer. If you're a lender, you can take it as a lender. If you're a charity, you can take it as a charity. And if you're a government body, you can take it as a government body. And let's thrash out new ideas, new concepts. And that is what I urge you to do. I also urge you to buy as many of these books that I have written, not just here, but during the book fair or till the end of the year. There's a lot of holidays coming up, Christmases, etc. All the money goes to Pet Central Animal Welfare Foundation that supports animal welfare groups that don't have charitable status and have a hard time raising money, so Pet Central Animal Welfare Foundation supports them. So on that note, thank you. Any questions, welcome. And if anyone wants to volunteer or get free tickets to the book fair, let me know. Happy to have you come there. I've got complimentary tickets. And thanks for coming, and keep eating and drinking. We can stay here all night. Any questions?
I've got a question.
Uh-oh. I'll start with you, Amanda.
Okay, so it's two things. You talk about housing affordability and renting, and you point to people who are.
Yeah, I'll let you.
You point to the person on the Statue of Liberty is homeless, right? But there are also up and coming young professionals in markets like Singapore, Australia, London, New York, who can never get on the property ladder. So they might have parents who own property, but they never can, they're priced down. So I'm just curious if you have a nuance for the difference, because there's the homeless who are probably unlikely to ever even be on that ladder, and at the moment there are a lot of young people, including my stepsons, who say they'll never be able to afford to buy a place.
No, that's a very good question, and that's the whole idea of rent subsidy, because it applies not only to rental, but buying and mortgages, where a person's income to pay for a mortgage should not exceed 15 to 25% either. So there has to be a limit on what one's income applies to mortgages. So the same argument applies. If banks and charities bridge the financing, because I remember even in LA as a young lawyer, it was very easy to buy a home. It was very affordable. You just made the down payment, mortgages were affordable, and you didn't have to hawk yourself. Whereas today, I know my grandkids, their friends, they can't afford to get on the housing ladder either. So it's a question of how do you get lenders, developers, on one hand, to agree on what a reasonable return is on that property, whether you're selling or renting, and then how do you make up the difference by subsidizing it from other bridge financing sources. And I'm saying the primary sources are the lenders who make most of that money and give very little of it back, which they can easily recoup in tax breaks, and the religious charities, who are supposed to take care of the needy or the community, and there's enough language there that would justify them even paying for people buying homes. If you have the right fund that is created in every city that is not run by bureaucrats, that is run by people who actually know banking, real estate, run it like a business, so it becomes a partnership between the public sector, private sector, charities. And it's a working relationship, not another government program run by bureaucrats. Because then, I've said this and I've read this, all bureaucrats care about is getting to retirement. So things will never get done until they retire. So I want bureaucrats out of everything. Just keep it to the business.
Now, I agree with what you said with Singapore. In Singapore, I know that from personal friends, it's possible that in a lifetime, in a working lifetime, they can afford an apartment. Very many times I know it from a lot of people. If you look at in Hong Kong now, and you say a private individual, it takes them probably 2 to 3 generations before they pay off the debt. But how do you really want to motivate and change the political side when 80% of the government advisors actually come from the property sector? And they're from the, 5 or 6 families that are in Hong Kong. So this, well,
I think that's what is going to change in Hong Kong, because I think the property sector has been put on notice by both Beijing and the local government. That's why a lot of the local developers are actually moving their money out of Hong Kong. and you're actually seeing a lot of developers publicly stating that the problem is not developers, it's bureaucratic laziness, quote unquote, that does not force the developers to change their ways. And this has been stated publicly by heads of one of the major development groups at public sessions. They realize that the game has to change. The game is changing. I mean, if you just look at what's been talked about even in the press the last 6 months about public housing, making public land, brownfields, all the options, and addressing the scams of people who go into public housing as they drive out in their Mercedes and go pick up the rent at the house that they bought as an investment and rent it out while they live in public housing. I mean, all you got to do is start cleaning up the scams, whether it's at the developer at the highest level or the people that scam the system because they know the right people and have the right connections. So you want to take care and avoid conflicts. Just do the right thing. Because otherwise, what we saw happen here, what we've seen happen in Hong Kong, 2014, 2019, all over the world, it's going to happen again. And it's going to get worse, especially if you look at and accept the fact that everyone agrees there are a lot of bubbles out there, whether it's a real estate bubble, a stock exchange bubble, something is going to burst in the near future. Never mind potential conflicts between the US, China, Philippines, Taiwan. I mean, I'm not getting into any of those issues on this chapter, but I do get into them in other chapters. But to me, it's yes, we have to tackle the problem at the core. And the core is the developer lobby, not only in Hong Kong, but Beijing. The strongest place that the local developers lobby is, historically it's been Hong Kong, but since the handover, it's Beijing. But that's changing because Xi Jinping put them on notice 2017. Housing is for living, not speculation. Things are changing. And I think you will see some changes, and I'm proposing one of the solutions that hopefully will be adopted.
A good comment about Singapore, and I agree entirely that the focus for discontent here in 2019 and beyond in the process was totally misplaced. That it should have been focused on the developers and their association with the government. The fact that they were hand in glove with the government and that they were cynically arranging property here for their own benefit to the exclusion of people who needed decent housing. And in Singapore, the comparison is very relevant. That didn't happen there. And it works there because of that. So here, the focus for discontent should have been the focus on housing, and it wasn't. It missed the boat big time.
Do you want to answer that, Bob? Because
Yes,
it sounds like Bob
totally.
wanted to answer it.
First of all, I think there's a clarification required here. I used to run an operation in Singapore. Singapore simply exported their housing problem to Johor Bahru. Thousands and thousands of Malays live in Johor Bahru, drive across the causeway every day. Very simple. That's why Singapore can do this. On top of that, they have 300,000 Bangladeshis, Burmese living in dormitories. And that's the Singapore trick. So I think any comparison between Hong Kong and Singapore is misplaced. Singapore is not this wonderful nirvana where all the problems are solved. And if you drive past any Singaporean construction site, you will see shanty towns where they put the migrant labourers who are building these beautiful houses for the Singaporeans. But that's on Singapore. I've lost my train.
Like the Middle East too.
Right,
You
the Middle
started
East
well,
too.
though.
But also now, coming to Peter's point. Peter, hello.
Pay attention.
Peter, you know, I think it's all very well, and I know everybody's favourite thing in Hong Kong is to blame the developers. The developers have nothing to do with the creation of public housing in Hong Kong. Public housing in Hong Kong
is the job of the housing authority. And they build at a hell of a rate. And they're nothing to do with Chung Kong or anybody else. They're private sector housing. And public housing in Hong Kong ain't bad. Take a look at some of the places down in Chung Kwai No, Hang Hao, whoa, Sea View, very nice. And these, I mean, I agree with you wholly on the point, but I don't think it's corruption, it's political. The reason that people are living in public housing is because there's no, as far as I know, ongoing means test. Once you're in for life. And you can get lucky, earn a fortune, you're still eligible for public housing. That's wrong. And that's something LegCo has never dared to take on because they know it's a time bomb. But I think it's short-sighted just to blame the developers. Yeah, they do the private sector, but what is it? 42% of Hong Kong people live in public housing? That's not bad. Compare that to many countries in the world.
Where we disagree again, Bob, as we usually do when we debate or discuss a subject, is it's the developers that put the pressure on the government here to make sure the public housing is not available. Who do you think the housing authority listens to? Why do you think the waiting time for public housing has gone to 5.8 years? Why? Because the developers would rather develop, get people to invest in properties and rent them out. It's a vicious cycle, but the developers control the government bureaucrats who don't do anything. And you're right, the housing authority should do it, but why don't they? Who's putting the pressure on them? It's called political lobbying. If you've worked with real estate developers.
I sent you the figures.
Yeah.
Hong Kong created more public housing in 3 years than New York in 10 years.
Forget New York. Talk about Hong Kong and compare it to the history of Hong Kong. History of Hong Kong has gone from 3 years to 5.8. It's taken longer and longer. If you compare Hong Kong to any other place, it's not going to work. Let's look at Hong Kong as Hong Kongers, and why are there so many people that are waiting for public housing? Why are there so many people that can't buy public housing or private housing or get into it? Let's look at it as Hong Kong. Yes, we can look at Singapore. Yes, we can look at every place else. But let's look at Hong Kong as Hong Kongers who are here, who all of us are being questioned. Why are we staying? Are we leaving? What's the solution? Forget the political issues, but housing issues. If you've got kids that are going to stay here, can they afford to get a house? Or are they going to have to rely on mom and dad and grandparents?
Basically, the government is very much to blame because this is a small circle election, you know, the chief executive. So she has to be sure she gets the support of those gangsters in the new territories and all that, right? So, I mean, you just take a look, right? You get high rises everywhere, then you go to new territories, you get these village houses, no proper roads, you know, all sorts of things. So, luxury housing in Hong Kong now has gone sky high. It's because of lack of freedom in China. So all those rich mainlanders who can afford a second home would come and invest in Hong Kong so they can do WhatsApp, they can watch YouTube, Google, whatever program they want to access. So there are many multiple reasons why the Hong Kong housing is in a dire state. But I blame the civil service. When I try to do a survey on unoccupied government property, they won't let me have the information. We still don't have the Right of Information Act or its equivalent in Hong Kong. So they want to know, why am I wanting this information? I said, why do I have to tell you? I want to know. I want to know about government wastage. You know, there are many, many empty government properties in Hong Kong, and they won't give me this information. And that's because when the industry, manufacturing move up north to China, there are many empty industrial buildings. And so those desperate people, you know, they will rent it even though it's illegal to live there as a resident or to even run an office from an industrial building. It's illegal, but it's happening. It's all over the place. And luckily, Hong Kong government believe in outsourcing Even the cleaner on the road is not a government servant. You know, it's outsourced. So you have subcontracting. So we had to pass a law that if the employer of a subcontractor is injured and the subcontractor goes bust, we can sue the head contractor. There came a point because there's too much outsourcing. So the price of anything gets more expensive with more intermediaries. So I'm afraid to say I blame it totally on Carrie Lam and her administration. They're just not effective, and they don't like people nosing into their affairs. We are only wanting to improve. We want to have the facts so we can improve. This right to information thing is a good thing. We should press for it. The right to information ordinance should be passed in Hong Kong immediately. Thank you.
But I have a quick question. Let's say we go with your 25% cap in terms of paying for rent. How do you stop people from picking where they live? Say say everybody wants to live on the Peak. Nobody wants to live in Sai Kung anymore, or Kowloon, or TST, or Jordan. You might have oversubscription to certain areas of Hong Kong, and you have certain empty plots. How do you convince people to live equally distributed and not oversubscribed?
Answer both questions, both of which, by the way, are addressed in here. The ding rights and the case on appeal is something that I address because the ding rights that are here in Hong Kong that have been here since colonial times used to exist in China as well. But the Communist Party, when it came to power, it got rid of them. So all the ding rights that existed north of the border that were identical to the ding rights here have been eradicated. I think the same is going to happen here. Yes, it's going to happen here. That's right. It's women as well. In terms of answering your question, Harp, in New York, what they're doing now, they are legislating that housing, and I pointed out in this chapter as well, that developments in high-priced, fancy neighborhoods include a number of units for, if you will, public housing. That's the only way you're going to integrate neighborhoods and start integrating the different racial issues in America. Because right now, basically, the racial divide in America is blacks, Latinos, whites, rich, poor. If you got money, yes, you can live in this neighborhood. New York now has introduced new housing, and they point out a very good argument that I raised here, that actually if you integrate new developments with housing for the needy, it actually generates more income for the local municipality that can then provide other services. And so to your case, someone wants to develop on the Peak, you're going to develop 100 units, make 10 units, 20 units, whatever number is going to be for affordable housing for those that need to be integrated in. Yes, the people that have a lot of money are going to go, oh, we don't like that. But you know what? It can be legislated by government. It's been done in New York. It can be done anywhere else if it can be done in New York.
You told us about one chapter of the book. Can you give us some hints on the rest of the book?
Of course. All you got to do is look at the table of contents. And it gets into, it's the same topics I got into this book. It's basically, if you will, a second edition follow-up from 9/11 to 1/6. I refer to January 6 as 1/6. And I deal with the political issues, rule of laws I raise, U.S.-China relations. I am a strong believer in the rule of law. I'm a strong believer in freedom of speech, and I'm a strong believer in freedom of the press, all of which are topics I tackle. And that's why when this book first came out, then when it went to the second print, as I pointed out in the introduction on the inner flap here, The second print, I added the word spin, custom-made spin, because there was too much BS in the media and it was spin. What we now refer to as fake news. So fake news has taken on a life of its own, which I have a major issue with too. So these are the issues I deal with. It's basically government, politics, law, press, sex, religion. My underlying premise on when I started writing the book, on the introduction to Custom Made, the basic premise was there's three things we are constantly admonished as we grow up. You don't talk about sex, religion, or politics. I had a problem with that, so I wanted to know why. So I started delving into the history of why is it that the political establishment and religious establishment don't want us to talk about them or sex. And I reached a very simple conclusion. That's because they're screwing us. And that's what I am tackling throughout. So those are the topics in the rest of the book, chapter by chapter. Thanks for coming. Keep drinking, keep eating, enjoy and make merry.